I thought I had everything money could buy until I heard her voice that Sunday afternoon in the park. What I did next completely shocked this beautiful poet, and what happened after that changed both our lives forever. This is my story, and I promise you've never heard anything like it. Hey everyone, before I share the most incredible love story that happened to me personally, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What I'm about to tell you is 100% real, and if you believe in true love, you need to hear this. So grab some popcorn, get comfortable, and let me tell you about the day my entire world changed. My name is Andrew, and 3 years ago, I was worth $2.8 billion. I know that sounds impressive, but let me tell you something. All that money meant absolutely nothing when I went to bed alone every single night in my empty penthouse overlooking Manhattan. I had built a tech empire from nothing, worked 80-hour weeks for 15 years straight, and achieved everything I thought I wanted. But I was the loneliest man in New York City. Every morning I'd wake up in my king-size bed that cost more than most people's cars, look out at the city I had conquered, and feel this crushing emptiness in my chest. My days were filled with board meetings, business deals, and people who only cared about what I could do for them. I ate at the finest restaurants, drove the most expensive cars, and owned properties around the world. But I had never experienced real love, real connection, or even a genuine conversation with someone who didn't know my net worth. That particular Sunday in October started like every other weekend. I was sitting in my office on the 47th floor, reviewing quarterly reports while the rest of the world was enjoying their day off. The numbers on my screen started blurring together, and for the first time in years, I actually felt sick of working. I closed my laptop, walked to the window, and stared down at the Central Park. There were families having picnics, couples walking hand in hand, kids playing on swings. Real people living real lives while I was trapped in my golden cage. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the elevator. My doorman looked shocked when I told him I was going for a walk. Alone, without security, without my driver. I hadn't walked through Central Park in over a decade. The autumn air felt incredible on my face, and for the first time in forever, I wasn't thinking about stock prices or acquisition deals. That's when I heard it. The most beautiful voice I had ever encountered, floating through the crisp October air like music. Someone was reading poetry, and their voice had this rich, warm quality that made me stop dead in my tracks. I followed the sound like I was in some kind of trance, weaving through joggers and dog walkers until I found the source. There she was, sitting cross-legged under this massive oak tree with golden leaves falling around her like confetti. She was the most stunning woman I had ever seen. Rich brown skin that seemed to glow in the dappled sunlight, natural hair that framed her face perfectly, and these expressive hands that moved gracefully as she read. But what stopped my heart wasn't just her beauty. It was the pure joy and passion in her voice as she shared these poems. She was reading to about 15 people, mostly elderly folks and a few kids, who sat on the grass around her like she was telling the most fascinating story in the world. Her book was worn and well-loved, and I could see handwritten notes in the margins. This wasn't some famous published work. These were her own poems, her own words, her own heart laid bare for strangers in the park. The poem she was reading was about hope, about finding light in darkness, about the beauty in everyday moments that most people rush past without noticing. Every word seemed to come straight from her soul, and I found myself hanging on every syllable. I hadn't read poetry since college, but the way she brought these words to life made me understand why people have been writing poems for thousands of years. Then a gust of wind swept through the park, and her book went flying. Pages scattered in different directions, and she jumped up with this look of panic on her face. Without thinking, I ran forward and caught the main book just before it landed in a puddle. When I handed it back to her, our eyes met for the first time, and I swear the world stopped spinning. "Thank you so much," she said, and her speaking voice was even more beautiful than when she was performing. "That book has all my original work in it. I would have been devastated if it got ruined." "Your original work?" I asked, trying to play it cool while my heart was pounding like a teenager's. "You wrote all of this?" She nodded with this shy smile that completely disarmed me. "I'm Isabella. I come here most Sundays to share my poetry with anyone who wants to listen. It's not much, but it makes people happy, and that makes me happy. I introduced myself as Andrew. Just Andrew. No mention of my company or my wealth or anything that might change how she looked at me. We talked for maybe 10 minutes while her audience slowly dispersed, and I learned that she worked as a waitress at a diner in Brooklyn, wrote poetry in her spare time, and had published one small collection that sold about 50 copies. She lived in a tiny studio apartment, took the subway everywhere, and somehow seemed more content with her life than I had ever been with mine. Before I lost my nerve, I asked if she'd like to get coffee sometime. She hesitated for a moment, and I held my breath. Then she smiled and said, "I'd like that. How about tomorrow afternoon? I know a great little place in my neighborhood." Walking away from that park, I felt more alive than I had in years. I couldn't stop thinking about Isabella, her laugh, her passion for poetry, the way she treated complete strangers like old friends. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying our conversation, wondering what she thought of me, hoping I hadn't imagined the connection I felt. The next day, I did something I hadn't done in 15 years. I canceled all my meetings. I told my assistant I was taking a personal day, and she looked at me like I had announced I was moving to Mars. I spent 2 hours getting ready for a coffee date, which was ridiculous for someone who usually threw on whatever my personal shopper had laid out. But this felt important. This felt real. The cafe Isabella had chosen was nothing like the upscale restaurants I usually frequented. It was this tiny place with mismatched furniture, local art on the walls, and coffee that cost $3 instead of 15. She was already there when I arrived, reading another book of poetry and sipping her coffee from a chipped mug. She looked up when I walked in, and her smile lit up the entire room. We talked for 4 hours straight. 4 hours. I learned that she had grown up in Atlanta, moved to New York to pursue her dreams, and worked double shifts to pay rent while writing poetry at night. She told me about her family, her hopes, her fears, her favorite books and movies and songs. She asked me about my life, and I found myself telling her things I had never shared with anyone. How lonely I felt, how I sometimes wondered if I had wasted my life chasing money instead of meaning. Of course, I wasn't completely honest. I told her I worked in tech, which was true, but I let her assume I was just some regular guy with a regular job. I couldn't bear the thought of her looking at me differently, treating me like a bank account instead of a person. For the first time in my adult life, someone was getting to know Andrew the man, not Andrew the billionaire. As we walked to the subway station together, she asked if I'd like to hear some of her new poems sometime. I said yes so quickly that she laughed, and the sound was better than any symphony I had ever heard. She gave me her phone number, written on a napkin from the cafe, and I guarded that piece of paper like it was made of gold. Our second date was at a free outdoor concert in Prospect Park. Isabella had packed sandwiches and lemonade in an old backpack, and we sat on a blanket she had brought from home. The music was good, but I barely heard it because I was so focused on her. The way she moved her hands when she talked, the way she threw her head back when she laughed, the way she looked at the world with such wonder and optimism despite having so little money. During a quiet song, she rested her head on my shoulder, and I thought my heart might explode. I had been on dates with models and actresses and socialites, but none of them had ever made me feel the way Isabella did with that simple gesture. I wanted to protect her, to make her happy, to be worthy of the trust she was placing in me. After the concert, she took me through her neighborhood, pointing out her favorite bookstore, the community garden where she sometimes wrote, the corner where she bought flowers from an elderly woman who always remembered her name. It was a completely different world from the one I lived in. Grittier, louder, more real. And I loved every second of it. That night, she invited me up to her apartment for the first time. It was exactly what I expected. Tiny, cramped, with barely any furniture. But it was filled with books and plants and little pieces of art she had collected over the years. Her poems were tacked to the walls, and she had this corner by the window where she wrote, with a view of the fire escape in the alley below. It was the most beautiful home I had ever been in because it was so completely her. We sat on her secondhand couch, and she read me some of her new work. Poems about love and loss, about dreams deferred and hopes renewed, about the strange magic of meeting someone who makes you believe in possibility again. I knew she was talking about me, about us, and I had never felt more honored in my life. When she finished reading, we were sitting very close together, and I could smell her perfume. Something light and floral that probably cost $20, but was more intoxicating than the most expensive fragrances money could buy. She looked up at me with those incredible brown eyes, and I couldn't help myself. I leaned in and kissed her. It was the most perfect first kiss in the history of first kisses. Soft and sweet and electric all at the same time. When we finally pulled apart, she smiled and said, "I was hoping you'd do that." We spent the rest of the evening talking and kissing and just being together, and I knew I was falling in love with her. Over the next few weeks, we fell into this beautiful routine. I would meet her after her shifts at the diner, and we'd walk through different neighborhoods, talking about everything and nothing. I started keeping a change of clothes at my office so I could meet her straight from work without looking too formal. I bought a MetroCard for the first time in my adult life. I learned to love bodega coffee and dollar pizza and all the small pleasures that Isabella had shown me. The hardest part was hiding my real life from her. When she complained about her rent being raised by $50 and not knowing how she'd make ends meet, I wanted to write her a check for $1 million. When she mentioned that her favorite independent bookstore was closing because they couldn't afford the rent increase, I wanted to buy the building and let them stay for free. When she got sick and couldn't afford to take time off work, I wanted to hire the best doctors in the city to take care of her. But I also knew that revealing my wealth would change everything between us. She would either think I was trying to buy her affection, or she would start seeing dollar signs instead of the man she was falling in love with. So I suffered in silence, watching the woman I loved struggle with problems I could solve in seconds. One evening, about 2 months into our relationship, Isabella was making dinner in her tiny kitchen. Spaghetti with marinara sauce from a jar, nothing fancy but made with so much love. I was sitting at her little table, watching her move around the space with such grace and efficiency. An old jazz record was playing on her ancient turntable, and she started swaying to the music as she stirred the sauce. I stood up and pulled her into my arms, and we started dancing right there between the stove and the refrigerator. She laughed and rested her head against my chest, and we swayed together to the music. In that moment, surrounded by the smell of garlic and the sound of Billie Holiday, I knew I wanted to dance with this woman for the rest of my life. "Isabella," I whispered into her hair. She hummed, not lifting her head. "I love you." She pulled back to look at me, and her eyes were shining with tears. "I love you too, Andrew. So much." We kissed right there in her kitchen, with the pasta water boiling over on the stove, and neither of us caring. It was perfect and messy and real, just like everything else about our relationship. But as our love grew stronger, my guilt grew heavier. I was living a double life, and the weight of my deception was crushing me. I started making plans to tell her the truth, to find a way to reveal my wealth without destroying what we had built together. I researched ways to help her without making it obvious. I planned romantic gestures that would show her how much she meant to me, and I tried to figure out how to make her understand that the man she had fallen in love with was still the same person, even if he happened to have a few $1 billion in the bank. The opportunity came when Isabella mentioned that her favorite bookstore, the one where we had spent countless hours browsing and reading together, was definitely closing at the end of the month. She was heartbroken about it, and I knew this was my chance to do something beautiful for her, while also preparing to reveal my secret. I bought the building, not just the bookstore, but the entire building. I met with the owners and worked out a deal where they could stay rent-free for as long as they wanted, and I set up a fund to help other small businesses in the neighborhood. Then I planned the most important conversation of my life. I told Isabella I wanted to show her something special, somewhere that meant a lot to me. I picked her up in my actual car, not the borrowed Honda Civic I had been using, and drove her to my penthouse. She was quiet during the elevator ride to the 47th floor, and I could see the questions in her eyes. When the elevator doors opened directly into my apartment, Isabella gasped. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the entire city. The space was bigger than most people's houses, filled with expensive art and furniture that cost more than she made in a year. "Andrew," she said slowly, turning to look at me with confusion and something that might have been fear. What is this place? It's my home, I said, my heart pounding so hard I thought she might hear it. Isabella, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you from the beginning. I led her to the windows and pointed out the buildings I own, the businesses I had started, the empire I had built. I told her about my company, my net worth, the life I lived when I wasn't with her. I explained why I had hidden it, how afraid I was of losing her, how she had given me something more valuable than all my money combined. Isabella listened in complete silence, her face changing from confusion to shock to something I couldn't read. When I finished talking, she just stared at me for a long moment. You're telling me, she said quietly, that you're a billionaire, that you've been lying to me for months, that while I've been stressed about rent and groceries and whether I can afford new shoes, you could have solved all my problems with pocket change. Isabella, please let me explain. No, she said, and her voice was shaking. You let me buy you dinner with money I didn't have. You watched me worry about $50 while you have billions. You made me feel like we were equals when you were just, what, slumming it with the poor girl for fun? It's not like that, I said desperately. Isabella, you have to understand. But she was already walking toward the elevator, tears streaming down her face. I need to go. I need to think. I can't even look at you right now. The elevator doors closed and she was gone. Just like that, the best thing that had ever happened to me disappeared. And I was alone again in my empty penthouse with all my worthless money. For 3 days, Isabella wouldn't answer my calls or texts. I sent flowers to her apartment, to the diner where she worked, to the park where we met. She sent them all back. I wrote her letters explaining how sorry I was, how much I loved her, how I would do anything to make this right. No response. On the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the bookstore, her bookstore, and waited for her to show up for her usual Sunday afternoon browse. When she walked in and saw me, she almost turned around and left. But something made her stay. Isabella, please, I said, standing up from the chair where I had been sitting for 3 hours. Just give me 5 minutes. Let me show you something. I led her to the back of the store, where the owner was setting up a small display. It was a collection of Isabella's poetry books, not the 50 copies she had self-published, but a beautiful new edition that a major publishing house had agreed to print. Her name was on the cover in elegant gold letters, and there was a small placard explaining that this was the inaugural selection for a new program supporting emerging poets. How did you? She started to ask, then stopped. You did this. I bought this building, I said, not to show off or to impress you, but because you told me how much this place meant to you, how much it would hurt to lose it. The publishing deal is real. They read your work and loved it. I just made sure they knew about you. Isabella picked up one of her books with trembling hands. Why? She whispered. Because I love you, I said simply. Because your poetry deserves to be read by millions of people. Because you make the world more beautiful just by being in it. Because I'm not the same person I was before I met you. And I never want to go back to being that lonely, empty man who had everything and nothing at the same time. She was crying now, clutching her book to her chest. You hurt me, Andrew. You made me feel like our entire relationship was built on a lie. The feelings were never a lie, I said. Everything I told you about how I feel, about how you changed my life, about how much I love you, all of that was completely true. The only thing I lied about was money, and money is the least important thing about who I am. At least it is now. You taught me that. We stood there in the quiet bookstore, surrounded by thousands of stories of love and loss and redemption, and I waited for her to decide our fate. Finally, she looked up at me with those beautiful brown eyes that had captured my heart that first day in the park. I need you to promise me something, she said. Anything. Promise me that you'll never lie to me again. About anything. Ever. I promise, I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. And promise me that you'll use your money to help people. Really help them. Not just write checks to feel good about yourself, but actually make a difference in the world. I promise, and I said again. She stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell her perfume again. And promise me that you'll take me to Paris. I've always wanted to see the Eiffel Tower. I laughed through my tears and pulled her into my arms. I promise. When do you want to leave? We flew to Paris the next week. Not on my private jet. Isabella said that was too much too fast, but first class on a commercial airline, which was still far more luxury than she had ever experienced. I watched her face light up as we walked along the Seine, visited the Louvre, and ate croissants at sidewalk cafes. She wrote poetry in a journal I bought her from a little shop in Montmartre, verses about second chances and forgiveness and the way love can surprise you when you least expect it. On our last night in Paris, I took her to dinner at a restaurant on the Eiffel Tower. She had no idea what I was planning. I had managed to keep this one secret. As we were finishing dessert, with the lights of Paris twinkling below us, I got down on one knee and pulled out a ring I had designed just for her. "Isabella," I said, my voice shaking with emotion, "you saved my life in every way a person can be saved. You taught me what really matters, what real love feels like, what it means to be truly happy. Will you marry me?" She said yes before I even finished the question, and I slipped the ring onto her finger as tears of joy streamed down both our faces. The other diners in the restaurant started applauding, and we kissed with the city of lights sparkling around us like something out of a fairy tale. We got married 6 months later in the same park where we met, under the same oak tree where I first heard her voice. It was a small ceremony, just family and close friends, but it was perfect. Isabella wore a simple white dress that cost a fraction of what most designer gowns cost, but she had never looked more beautiful. She read original vows that she had written in poetry form, and there wasn't a dry eye in the place. For our first dance, we chose the same jazz song that had been playing in her kitchen the night we first said, "I love you." As we swayed together in front of our friends and family, with autumn leaves falling around us like confetti, I thought about how different my life was from that lonely Sunday when I first wandered into the park. That was 2 years ago, and Isabella and I have been happily married ever since. She still writes poetry, but now she has a publishing deal and a growing readership who love her work as much as I do. We started a foundation together that supports emerging artists and helps keep independent bookstores and community spaces open. She still insists on taking the subway sometimes, and she still makes the best spaghetti with marinara sauce I've ever tasted. We live in a smaller apartment now, not tiny like her old studio, but not a massive penthouse either. Something comfortable and cozy that feels like a home. Isabella decorated it with plants and books and little pieces of art from local artists, and it's the most beautiful space I've ever lived in because it's filled with love. Every Sunday we go back to Central Park. Sometimes Isabella reads her new poetry to the same group of regulars who have been coming for years. Sometimes we just walk hand in hand, talking about our dreams and plans and all the adventures we want to have together. And sometimes we sit under that oak tree where we met, and I marvel at how one chance encounter, one gust of wind, one dropped book of poems changed everything. People ask me all the time if I miss my old life, if I regret giving up the parties and the status and the constant pursuit of more money. The answer is simple. I don't miss any of it. How could I miss being empty when I'm now so full? How could I miss being alone when I have Isabella? How could I miss having everything when I now have the only thing that really matters? Isabella taught me that love isn't something you can buy or earn or deserve. It's something that finds you when you're brave enough to be yourself, vulnerable enough to open your heart, and lucky enough to meet someone who sees the real you and loves you anyway. She taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in moments of connection, in shared laughter, in the feeling of being completely known and accepted by another person. And that's how a chance encounter in Central Park led to the love of my life. Isabella and I have been married for 2 years now, and every day I'm grateful for that windy Sunday afternoon when her book flew into my hands. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to believe in love again. And don't forget to subscribe because I have more incredible real-life stories coming your way. Remember, love can find you when you least expect it, in the most ordinary places. Sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the simplest moments: a dropped book, a chance conversation, a willingness to see someone for who they really are. Thanks for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that no matter how lost or lonely you might feel, Your own love story could be just around the corner.